is changing at a rate that we've never seen before. From business to art to sports, these changes are affecting every aspect of our lives. My name is Nick Castner, and we're setting out to talk with the people who are altering the way things are done. Along with Alec McChesney, this is the Commonwealth. Our guest today is Dr. Anna Hushlak, who is the co-founder and chief scientist of Ferly, which is an app disrupting society's relationship with sex. Anna, thank you for coming on the show with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, so to start with, I'm 24 years old, and I had a little pep talk to myself that I needed to have a mature conversation about sex beforehand. But if I have some goofy smile on my face, just tell me to wipe this first. To it. Yeah, as I'm sure you are. So to start with, what is Ferly?
So Ferly is an audio guide to mindful sex. At the moment, we have 3 different types of content that we offer, and everything is delivered via audio. Okay. So that includes the kind of food for thought type content. So that's podcast style, sciencey bits on everything from what's an orgasm, what's desire, what's the vulva, and that's really designed around kind of providing easy digestible science around the body and the psychology or psychologies. The second stream of content that we've got in there is around guided practices, and this is very much based on a learning by doing approach to basically discovering your body and discovering your mind. Okay. And so those include everything from waiting for you to have the awkward smile. Okay. From mindful masturbation. Okay. To kind of more psychotherapy type exercises that look at negative thinking, to conversations around intimacy and communication for partners. Okay. And the third style of content we've got in that is sensual stories, and that's all around not just helping women unwind, but also understanding how fantasy can be used to explore boundaries in a more passive way, and to kind of get a sense of what makes women tick and not tick, and how they can feel more explorative and kind of become discoverers of their own body.
Okay, so from the user, how does it work once they download the app from the Apple App Store, or like what?
What's the journey of it?
Yes, yeah. And is the content tailored to the specific user?
So we've actually just released a whole new onboarding feature, which is around basically helping women understand where they're at and then monitoring and evaluating those fluctuations over time. So I download the app, I come into it, and then I get asked a series of questions, and those questions are based on this kind of well-being framework that I've designed with a bunch of different psychosexual therapists, and then off of different national health kind of surveys around what healthy looks like and doesn't look like. So the user will get guided through a series of those questions, and those are all based around questions related to their pleasure, related to their confidence, and then related to their health. And then based on how they kind of measure up around those, we then direct them to different styles of content and different content to help them tackle certain pains or certain areas where we think they can improve.
Okay, and who's your target user or audience?
So it's interesting, actually. Our target user and audience are women or folks with vulvas that are between kind of 25 to 40. What we found is there's so many more users than that, because I think sex is a pretty universal subject and a universal topic. But most of the users we have tend to be coming from backgrounds where they've kind of had a more negative or a more neutral relationship to sex. So a lot of them are coming in from having kind of experiences of low libido, or feeling anxious during sex, or questions around how do I get in the mood? How do I learn to have an orgasm? How do I start to understand my body? And so most of them are kind of in the stages of exploring how to have a better relationship with sex. Some of them know that they don't have a great one, and other ones are just kind of like, I could maybe improve on this. But overall, the typical user for us is one that's looking to actually, take a more mindful approach to sex and feel more positive about it.
And how about location? Like, is it just
actually
in the UK?
All over the world?
Worldwide.
So we've got users at the moment now in 53 countries around the world. Most of them are UK, Europe, and the US, but there's everything from users in the Philippines to Saudi Arabia to South America, countries in South America. So yeah, it's really actually quite global.
Wow. Okay. And then, so when did you start this? Like, when did this journey begin?
Well, I mean, that's probably a bigger question, but
okay. Well,
I was born.
the Ferly one, and then later we'll get into
the rudder one.
Yes, yeah, we'll get into the rudder one later.
So the Ferly journey came out of a business builder called Zinc, and that's where I met my co-founder and our CEO, Billy.
Okay. What's a business builder?
Yeah, so it's interesting wording that they're choosing on that. Okay. It's very similar to an incubator or an accelerator, but the difference is they kind of take people from various different backgrounds, so tech, business, product,
scientists like yourself.
Yeah. And none of us know one another before we go into it. So the idea is that you start out and you don't have a team and you don't have an idea. So unlike typical kind of incubators and accelerators where you generally come in with something you already work on, this is more around, we want to bring these people who are basically really interested in a particular mission or a problem. So the mission that we were on was the first one, and that was around using technology to improve the mental and emotional well-being of women and girls. So it was very much an interest in the domain space, but we had no idea what we were going to do, and we had no idea who we actually was. Were.
Yeah,
so,
fine.
You never know that. So we started on Zinc, which was 6 months long, and then basically from that, Ferly was born, and that would have been, when did we do Zinc? 2018? And then we officially became a company in 2019.
Okay. And Zinc's located here in London?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Zinc is a London-based company. And I think they're actually on their third mission now. So it's a different mission every year.
Okay.
And luckily, and somewhat intentionally, the one that we were on was around combination of kind of gender equality and then health and well-being.
Okay. So then how did this, what was the structure of that, that you, how did you run into your co-founder and then decide that you would tackle this issue?
I think part of the interesting thing about being on the first mission was there almost wasn't a structure. So there was, but I think one of the joys about it is it's as much about you discovering and kind of just throwing yourself in and figuring out what works and doesn't work as it is about just experimentation. So it's the kind of first 3 months of it were more around getting a sense of who you might want to work with and just exploring different ideas. So within that, we had opportunities to meet all the other people on the program. There was 55 of us in total. And a lot of that was getting a sense of who works well together, who doesn't, who has similar values, similar interests, who has similar ambitions, etc., etc. And it's interesting because actually... so they talk about co-founder breakups and that kind of thing. Yeah. You try things out and then you're like, oh, it's not really working. We're going to break it off. Billy and I from day one were like, cool, we're in it.
Okay.
So it was really interesting. And I think for us, part of the reason we connected was around the topic of sex. So within that first few weeks, Zinc brought in a whole bunch of really phenomenal experts from different backgrounds. Everything from looking at researchers working with kind of bipolar schizophrenia to questions around fertility, to old age. And I think what we found really interesting was nobody came in to speak about sex at all. And so I think for Bills and I, it was a thing of how can you have this program that's about women and girls and mental and emotional health, specifically off of the backs of kind of, the momentum around fourth wave feminism and the Me Too movement and all this kind of stuff. And yet nobody's talking about sex. So we sat down and we had a chat about it, and both of us have had our own journeys around getting comfortable with sex and our sexualities and kind of eroticism and what that means. But it was very much a thing of saying this needs to be addressed, and we're just so aligned on it. So I think we came together in that simultaneously through a shared sense of purpose and belief in a really core areas of our lives, as well as a sense of shared level of kind of ambition and values for us was just so important. And then from there, it was just a matter of kind of exploring the space of sex, which is not a small space to explore either.
Yeah. So how did you arrive on the product once decided?
Once we kind of got on that. Yeah. So it was. So my background being science and research, basically spent a good kind of 6 to 9 months just deep diving into the whole domain. So everywhere from tantra to pornography to sex therapy to intimacy to dysfunction to well-being and all this, basically trying to get a scope of the whole landscape. And in doing that, we did, spoke to hundreds and hundreds of women, and men as well. We did surveys, we did focus groups, we did workshops. And through that, the kind of recurring themes that kept coming up time and time again were, I want to have better sex. Okay, what does better actually mean? Well, I have a pretty shit relationship to sex, and sex makes me really uncomfortable. And then it was like, okay, well, let's work backwards from that. So where does that come from? Okay, sex education is failing us in this way. Pornography is influencing us in this way. Family shame, stigma, taboos influence in that way. And the main thing that we found was basically women don't have the opportunity to explore their bodies. And they don't necessarily feel confident communicating what they want. So for us, it was a question of how do we build a product that basically redefines and takes sex ed as it's traditionally been done and does it in a totally different way, in a much more experiential way, in a way that encourages learning through doing. And how do we approach the way we think about sex ed through the lens of adults, because it's not something that is unique to teens.
Yeah.
And it's something that changes and fluctuates throughout our lifetime, and we don't generally treat sexuality that way. And how do we also think about it in a way that's more holistic and more integrated? So rather than thinking about periods and menstruation and reproduction as kind of separate things, or pregnancy and STIs, how do we think about understanding our biology? How do we think about understanding our psychology? And how do we understand our kind of social environments and looking at how that's all interacted and integrated with one another? And so that led us to basically come up with where we are now.
Okay.
So it was, we need to figure out some way of delivering this content that takes a much more kind of systematic and holistic approach to learning and exploring sex. We need to make it catered to women, and we need to make it easy to understand, accessible, and digestible. So that's kind of where we got to.
Yeah. So that... did you develop the product before raising money, or like do either you or Billy have any technical skills that you built?
No background in that whatsoever.
Okay. So how did you actually build that first product?
So it was I think what we are good at is Bill's is phenomenal at hustling and storytelling and just getting stuff done and executing, and she's got this amazing momentum and ability to bring people on a journey with her. And I think for me, there was a lot of, in some ways, academia is not that different from entrepreneurship, in that you've got a research question, a whole bunch of uncertainty, a whole bunch of assumptions, and then you basically need to figure out ways of testing that and coming up with a solution.
Okay.
So it was kind of applying...
I would never make that parallel, by the way. I would say they're very different, so it's interesting.
Yeah. I think they're different in terms of pace, and I think, I've got my own issues with academia as a massive institution, but I think the skills that are needed to be a researcher, whether you're in academia or in entrepreneurship, are actually incredibly similar. And down to the thing of like, you're constantly trying to chase money for grants or funding. You are getting constantly rejected from publications and told your work's not good enough.
Yeah.
So I think there's a whole kind of thing around and you're basically looking for feedback. You've identified a problem or a question, and then you're essentially going out and getting as much data as you can to understand it, and then coming up with a way of basically feeding that back. In the case of research, it's a paper. In the case of entrepreneurship, it's a product.
Yeah.
So I think kind of applying that lens with Bill's amazing, again, momentum for storytelling and executing and innovating allowed us to really just iterate and experiment. So the whole kind of first stage of it was very much also learning about human-centered design and ethical technology was a big thing for us, and basically applying methods that I knew from research, kind of learning as much as I could about human-centered design, and then going out with a piece of paper and testing that. We did have, in the kind of earlier stages, support from one of our original co-founders, who was a technologist, but ended up having our co-founder breakup, as we do in the early stages, which is all very amicable and probably as lovely as co-founder breakups can go. So that helped us get on board, but definitely we were doing everything very much from scratch and kind of pen and paper, mock-ups, wireframes, post-its, and conversations, and then just drawing on that and iterating. I think the biggest lesson was to actually stay away from technology for as long as we could.
Interesting.
We're going to take a quick break to let you know how you can help us grow this community. We view the Commonwealth as a group of people working to change the world. By listening and supporting this show, you're crucial members of the Commonwealth. To continue this work, we need help growing our community. Please invite your friends to like the Commonwealth's Facebook page. The link and directions are in our show notes. Now, back to the conversation.
But you all eventually did raise money, correct? Yes. What was that process like?
So it's interesting because I think Billy and I.
How much did you raise? I guess, before?
So we've just closed. A few months ago, closed our round, and we haven't officially made any announcements on that. But it would be upwards of $1 million.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And then what was the process like?
So yeah, it was actually not. In some ways, it was very straightforward. In other ways, it was not. And I think we expected, kind of at the time, being told you're two female founders, first-time founders, young women talking about sex. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
And, some of the feedback we had was, you'll never get funding without a male co-founder. You'll never get funding if you haven't built a company before. You'll never get funding if you're talking about sex. And there was a lot of... definitely a lot of skepticism around it.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough for us, we actually found that was a really powerful way of vetting the conversations we wanted to have and with who. So it meant that it allowed us to get a really phenomenal lineup of investors and to have conversations with them that allowed us to kind of temper check whether or not we thought they would be a good fit based on value alignment. There was definitely some conversations we had where, we'd hear things like, oh, well, are women really a big enough market? Yeah.
Yeah. Like half of the population.
Yeah, exactly. When's this going to be for men? Because women's kind of too small of an audience.
Are most of the venture capitalists you're pitching, are they all men, I'm guessing? All white men? Or
not necessarily, actually. And again, that's something we've been, one, really lucky, but two, also very strategic about in that at the moment... actually, most of our investors, if not all of our kind of the people we interact with in those funds, are all women. So we do have some really phenomenal male investors in there as well too,
right.
And they very much get what we're working on, and they're complete advocates for gender equality. But actually, in our case, one of the things we want to be quite strict about is, okay, how many partners does this fund have that are females? Do we have a point of contact at this fund that's females? How many female companies have these companies, have they invested in? So It actually was an interesting point for us to think about how do we take gender equality and focus on kind of empowering women, not just in the product we're building, but also in the actual value and the kind of ethos of the company itself.
Interesting. So now, shifting back more into the product, how do you ensure that that it works for all different types of women?
So I think that's been a really, it's a miracle question.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we've found is because the topic we're working in is, it's simultaneously individual but also collective, and it's as much about your physiology as it is about politics and the social climate. And so it's an interesting one to navigate because it's this question of how do you be inclusive and how do you celebrate and actually make sure you're adhering for diversity. But what does that actually mean, and how do you do it, and can you actually do it, and are we the right people to be doing it, in that we're kind of, two white cisgendered women. So do we actually have the right to be speaking for, and I would say no, for communities that we're not part of.
Yeah.
So I think in our kind of exploration of it, it's been very much thinking of it as kind of being feminists in progress, or learning how to do this always in progress, and knowing that we're going to get things wrong. But I think one of the challenges we found was in the very early stages of trying to be for everyone, and not just women per se, but also thinking about how could we support men, how can we support the trans community, etc., was a realization that actually, in our instance, we're focused on women because there's all this research around the pleasure gap, around differences in kind of anxiety, anxiousness during sex, lack of enjoyment, etc.
What's the pleasure gap?
So the pleasure gap is basically, and it's particularly apparent in heterosexual couples, actually, in the LGBTQ community. It doesn't exist in the same way as it does with heterosexuals. So a lot for us to learn from the other communities. But it's basically a difference in rates of orgasm between men and women. So statistically, men are much more likely to orgasm and report pleasurable sex. Women are much more likely to report, So, for example, in the UK, 51% of women report lack of enjoyment, anxiousness during sex, and pain during sex in the last 4 months of a sexual experience. So, not just about orgasm. I think traditionally we've looked at the pleasure gap as a focus on orgasm. I would say, certainly at Ferly, and I think a lot of the people operating in the space would actually advocate moving the focus away from orgasm because it makes sex about a goal rather than about an experience. But realistically, focusing just on orgasm itself, there's no reason why women should not be able to climax as much as men climax. But there are very obvious gaps in the ability to do so, and a lot of that is actually much more down to questions around shame and stigma with their bodies, questions around not wanting to be, associated with being slutty or dirty or anything like that. And a lot of it's actually, it's that whole thing of like sex happens between your ears, not between your legs. The pleasure gap is basically a kind of inequality between men and women, again, specifically predominantly in heterosexual kind of relationships, in ability to climax and pleasure during sex.
And why do you think that happens in heterosexual relationships but not?
Again, I think I can make assumptions, but I'm probably not the one to speak on behalf of other communities.
Okay, fair enough.
But I would say certainly from the research we've done and the kind of conversations we've had with, everywhere from doctors to kind of gynecologists to psychosexual therapists in the space, is the main differences in heterosexual couples comes down to communication would be a massive one. And I think this is where you see things like, again, regardless of orientation, but toxic masculinity really playing into it in terms of certain narratives around what it means to be a man, manliness, how you communicate that, certain sense of like performance. I think for women, there's a continued shame and stigma around taboos, specifically around female pleasure. I think if you think in sex ed, masturbation and kind of that sort of stuff for women's not really covered at all. It's very much around like, don't get pregnant, don't get an STI, you'll have a period. So I think women aren't really encouraged to have pleasure in the same way that men, whether they've explicitly or implicitly been encouraged to do so, are. And so I think, again, not being somebody to speak on behalf of those communities, but my hypothesis would be within, for example, lesbian couples, there's more of an openness and kind of, I imagine the journeys that folks from those backgrounds have had to go through to get there has involved being much more interrogative of sexuality and being in spaces that are much more conducive to communication and open in exploring those sexualities. I think often in heterosexual couples, there's certain, and also, monogamy is another interesting one in that, but there's certain narratives and kind of scripts we've been told around like what success looks like and good looks like and what your role in that relationship is. And I think it's very difficult to break out of those social scripts.
Okay, interesting. So my next question deals with managing volatility as an entrepreneur. That you kind of touched on the early feedback being an obstacle, but then at the same time you have been featured in Forbes and some of the biggest publications in the world. First, what is that like? Like experiencing those incredibly highs and incredible lows?
I think what is it like?
So that Forbes article, I'm sure that did wonders for your downloads a day.
Do you know, it's interesting actually. Most of our audience is much more digital. So we did just have we did a feature. We were featured in the London Times, and it was amazing. But actually, if we look at our traffic in terms of interest in the app, most of it actually comes from more digital media as opposed to print media.
Okay.
Seems that not a lot of 25 to 35-year-old women are
picking up the London Times,
the Times on Sunday and reading the features. So I think in terms of kind of PR, it's been really interesting because we actually, all of it's been organic. So I think what's been more powerful for us is actually confirmation of what we're doing matters. In that, basically all of our downloads to date have been from people just coming in organically because they've been recommended by a friend or by a psychotherapist, or they've kind of stumbled across something, as opposed to it actually being active campaigns. So I think that in some ways is more humbling than having those articles written and them featured themselves.
Okay.
That being said, there is something pretty cool about seeing it, because it is that kind of thing of like, shit, I guess that this is real. And, we obviously believe in it, but the rest of the world and people out there are also believing in it too. And I think there's something that's hugely, energizing that and humbling in that and inspiring in that. And I think the interesting thing, I think, for Billy and I as well, is there's very much a sense of kind of responsibility and duty to the women that we've had conversations with and the women that we serve.
Okay.
And so there's a sense of like, all that stuff's great, but actually, are we doing what we want to do? Are we building the product we want to build? Are we solving the problem we're trying to solve? And while that stuff's great, it's also like, it's not that it's superficial, but it's this thing of saying, okay, is this changing person A's experience on the ground? Yeah. And I think that for us is the more significant question of, I think the feedback when we have some of our users messaging us to say, I've just been able to do this for the first time, or I've just had this experience and I've come from a background of kind of trauma and this has allowed me to do this and I never thought I'd be able to, or thank you for X and Y. I think that's actually way more powerful for us than the articles in the big publications.
Okay. And then you also keep that in mind when the venture capitalists are saying the female market isn't big enough? Is that...
I think actually it's with the kind of surge of the femtech movement. I think keeping in mind we originally went out to fundraise, kind of a year and a half ago, and that movement was there, but it was still kind of just starting to happen. I think now it would be very unlikely to find a kind of a fund that's in the know. That would still say that women aren't a big enough market.
Okay.
And I also think to the conversations to the point of earlier, the conversations we have with our current investors, like the reason why we are so excited to be working with them and why we were working together is that they fundamentally absolutely get what we do, and they're kind of radicals in their own space and innovating in their own space, and have been 100% supportive and encouraging us to do the same. Okay. So yeah, it's been a good filtering method.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, so Anna, what's your background in? How where are you from? I guess to start with,
strange accent question.
Yeah.
So I'm from Canada.
Okay.
I've been out of Canada for 12 years. So whenever I go back home, Canadians always ask me where I'm from.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, just literally down the block. So kind of in that time, basically have been full-time between academia and advocacy work, so jumping kind of between doing research and then working in the nonprofit sector. And that's been kind of Mexico, Honduras, South Africa, the UK, obviously. And then that kind of led me to doing how I ended up in the UK was I moved here to do my PhD, and then finished that up in Oxford a couple of years ago, and then went straight into Zinc after that.
Okay.
It was kind of a don't know what to do, but know that I don't fit in anywhere else, so let's try this.
Yeah, so was all of your, or both your research and the nonprofit work, was it both based in sex and sexual
Not
wellness?
At all,
no,
actually.
Okay.
Which was the interesting thing. And I think I was actually saying to somebody the other day, I feel like I've done a second PhD in female sexuality, but
yeah.
No, my background was in environmental sciences. So very different fields. But what I think was interesting about it is the work that I've always done has been with kind of vulnerable and marginal communities, of which gender plays a very large role in it. And so a lot of my research was looking at kind of either climate activism or environmental management. And within those, if you look at communities on the ground that are often the most affected by those things, it tends to be the kind of more vulnerable communities, and specifically in that women are particularly hit. So there's always been an interest in the gender side of it, and I think it was just I wasn't quite sure which lens was best suited for me to tackle that with.
Okay. And then why is gender a topic that has been
of interest?
Yes, of interest throughout your career.
I think it was one of those topics that I didn't realize was an interest, and it's something when you kind of look back and you're like, that's that thread that stitches that all together. I think the broader interest has always been around helping people lead better lives, and particularly helping people who are disempowered. And so I think that just kind of naturally, and then with my own experiences as a woman, led me to be more interested in tackling questions around kind of gender equality. I think certainly within the last few years, well, I mean, not just that. I think living in countries where there's much more kind of overt issues, for example, around sexual violence, or around kind of economic inequalities, it was something that I was always aware were issues, but it felt like this is kind of like another country issue.
Yeah.
And I think, coming from Canada and the UK, I think in some ways I realised it was there, but I don't think I realised how much it was there until I started digging. Because when I compared it to living in countries like, Honduras, for example, it's much more explicit there. And I think in kind of systems like Canada and the UK, it's much more embedded in the way in which we operate. So I think it was starting to kind of, over the last few years, uncover what feels sometimes much more covert or entrenched in those systems, and starting to just like really dig into them. And I think the kind of specific interest in sex, both for Bills and I, so Billy was sexually assaulted at work. And I think that really forced her to kind of reevaluate her own relationship to sex, how it's very much a part of our identities, and to develop, again, kind of challenge the systems that are in place that allowed that to happen, and that didn't necessarily support her to move through that when it did happen. And I think for me, was a survivor of sexual violence as well from when I was younger, which didn't take place in the way in which I was taught sexual violence actually takes place.
Okay.
So I think there was then a certain amount of guilt around saying, is my experience less valid than other people's experience because it wasn't necessarily as, explicitly violent. And so I think...
Do you mind sharing what it was?
Yeah, not at all. So when I was 15, I was raped and lost my virginity through rape. But I didn't... It wasn't a rape in the sense of, stranger in an alley, alcohol involved.
Yeah.
Whatever.
The traditional
exactly.
construct that people think it is.
But in every other instance, that's absolutely what it was. And I think it was interesting because at the time I knew it, but I was almost uncomfortable with it. So I ended up I was trying to laugh it off or joke it off as if it wasn't a big deal, because I felt like somehow it was my fault for not understanding it. And I think, it was not until kind of years later of actually reflecting on that experience and being like, oh, that's actually what that was. And the kind of knock-on effects of that in terms of the type of role I thought I had to play in relationships, and I think Billy also experienced this with hers, is this sense of being defined by our sexualities in a way that we don't necessarily have control over. And so I think part of it was wanting to basically develop autonomy over sexualities again, and to own our power on our terms. And to really just reflect on what that means, and to understand that, again, sex is just so much more than physical. And it's as much, it's as important to understand not just how we have sex, but how we actually feel about having sex. And that's not something we often take the time to do.
Interesting. So last question, what advice would you give someone on like channeling like a previous history or previous experience into launching something to move the world forward?
It was interesting. I was actually just having a conversation around this the other day.
Okay.
I think the biggest thing that we've found is understand the problem. So I think and actually believe in the problem you're trying to do. So I think one of the biggest things was like, I think at the time we didn't necessarily realize we were good at it, but now we actually know we're good at what we do. I think there was some confidence in that and stepping into that role, because it can be quite intimidating. But I think it's been a thing of saying, don't just do what you're good at, but actually do what you believe in. Because as you said, like the volatility and the roller coaster of being an entrepreneur is all over the place. And I think certainly for us, if we didn't get those messages from women saying thank you, that you've literally helped me change my life, we would not have the stamina to get through the stuff we get through, because nobody becomes an entrepreneur because it's an easy thing to do. It could not be a crazier job to take, in that it's like, great, do you want to have no set hours? Do you want to have like no financial certainty? Like, do you want to know if you're going to still have a job in 6 months? Like, okay, great. Does that sound like the dream job? Not really. And so I think making sure that, in terms of like being able to channel it, know that you fundamentally through and through believe in what it is you're doing, and that you also have a way of celebrating the wins in that and measuring that belief, because I think it's also very easy to say, cool, we want to do this and we want to change the world, but then not really know how you're doing it, or able to kind of remind yourself of the ways in which you're doing it. So for example, for us, getting the feedback from our community is one of those ways that every time we do, it's just like, okay, this is why we're here, this is why we're doing it, this is why we've like sacrificed relationships and compromised on well-being and all these things which we're learning how to get better at. But the reason why we're still here is because, person A shared this story with us, and we know that is a very real difference. So I think, the kind of wrapping that up would be, again, doing something that you believe in, not just doing something you can do.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the show with me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't have some weird smirk the whole time.
No, you didn't.
Yes. I kept it inside. Yes.
Gonna go in the bathroom and like have a giggle.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Hannah.
Thank you.
And that is it for today's episode. Thanks for being a member of the Commonwealth. If you enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends about us and leave a review. If you're interested in helping us grow this community, please invite your friends to like our Facebook page. The link and directions are in our show notes. We release episodes every Monday, so stay tuned for next week.